WCG board is glad to host you all for our first virtual program of the season. Our next member meeting will be held virtually on Thursday, January 8th, and it will feature archaeological conservation in historic St. Mary's City. Please note that due to the government shutdown this fall, the annual three-ring circus meeting has been moved to Thursday, February 5th. The three-ring call for abstracts has been extended, and its new deadline is next week, close of business on Wednesday, December 10th. Continuing on with our meeting tonight, WCG would like to thank the 2025 to 2026 season sponsors, including University Products, TrueView, Dorfman Museum Figures, Gaylord Archival, Caring for Textiles, Click Netherfield, and Small Corp. Their donations enable WCG to provide networking events, educational programming, honoraria for speakers, and admission for members to attend historic venue tours, such as our upcoming Annapolis WCG member tour on Saturday. Thank you all for listening, and I'll pass the microphone to Director Jen McNulty, who will introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you so much, Kiara. Good evening, everyone. I am so pleased to introduce Dr. Susan Buck to you all. Susan is an art conservator and paint analyst in private practice with over 20 years of experience, and she joins us tonight to present her research into the complex paint histories of the interior and exterior of the grand 1767 Brice House in Annapolis, Maryland. I am so excited to hear what she has to share with us today. Please note that there will be a Q&A period following the lecture, and we do ask that you please hold your questions until that time. And with that, I think I will pass things over to you, Susan.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Let's see. Oops, sorry. So I'm very happy to be able to talk about this project. Everything came to a stop during the pandemic, but most of my work there had been completed before the job site was closed. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is not all of my findings, but some key findings, both on the interior and the exterior. As you can see, the house is huge, and this project is a massive one. So I don't have time, nor would you be interested in seeing the findings in each space, but I've chosen some very particular rooms and some, I think, kind of unusual discoveries that relate to helping to interpret how this house was lived in originally by James Brice and his family. So this is when I got started. The house has been closed to the public for a number of years now. And my primary goals for this were to identify the paint chronologies in each room and look for surviving paint evidence on the exterior trim and brickwork. So exteriors are particularly difficult because of weathering and exposure and scraping. So you'll see that I had to search harder for the evidence. And then I was working with architectural historians and preservation architects who wanted to use the paint histories as archaeological tools because, as I'll describe later, many rooms got altered as the building changed hands. And then there were some key findings where it was important to put the evidence into context with other contemporary Annapolis buildings. And this is a city of very grand brick buildings, and the Brice House is only one. And then in certain areas, I did some overpaint removal to see if we could reveal original decorations. Pigment ID was a key part of this in terms of understanding how paints changed over time and also the relative expense. And then lastly, the ongoing work now with architectural conservators who are doing exposures and removal to reveal decorative finishes and decorative elements. It's a house with tremendous amount of documentation, including surviving account books and an inventory at the death of James Brice. So a lot happened to this house, although it remained in the family for about 100 years. The key points for change occurred after the house was purchased, first by the proprietors of the Carville Hall Hotel. You can imagine that this building, which is in the center of Annapolis and is huge, would make a promising hotel. And then it was purchased by St. John's College in the 1920s, then privately owned, beginning in 1953, and some major restorations took place under Mr. and Mrs. Stanley Wall. In 1970, it was declared a National Historic Landmark, but in 1979, it was purchased by the International Union of Bricklayers and Allied Craftsmen, and I think they probably did more damage to paints than any of the other previous owners, as they created offices primarily on the second floor. Then the state of Maryland purchased it in 2014, and in 2016, the Historic Structure Report research started, and I started working with the architectural conservators. But it's an important location. It's only 2 blocks from the State House, so it's right in downtown Annapolis. And its grounds were much more extensive than now. But we have some good documentary photographs from 1964. So at one point in time, we know how this house appeared. And I work out of my own lab in Williamsburg, and it's a modest lab for optical microscopy. So those are my primary tools. I use cross sections to look at the paint stratigraphies, and plain polarized transmitted light to look at pigments and fibers. And then these are kind of basic tools for art conservators, so I'm sure all of you are familiar with the kind of findings that you can get from this type of analysis. And then I use a colorimeter microscope for doing color measurement and matching. And this 30 times magnification colorimeter allows me to measure samples as small as 0.3 millimeters. That's not ideal, but if there's only tiny bits of information, this can really help. So let's start with the exterior. And the best place to find exterior paints are usually areas that are protected by an overhang, like a porch, or in this case, the soffit of the cornice. And you can see when you start looking at these elements that the decorations are pretty filled up with paint. So this is a lot of repainting on a surface that's quite inaccessible. But I was taking my samples deep in the interstices of the design or at the rear edge of the soffit to hopefully find elements that had preserved paint intact without exposure to sun and rain and frost. And when you look at these cross sections first of the soffit, what you see is kind of disrupted cross sections, but in fact, there's remnants of the first off-white paint here. You always look for dirt trapped between the layers. And here, I think these have been deformed by heat, but you do see soot and dirt trapped between the layers. And these have slightly different quality in terms of color and translucency and also autofluorescence. So a lot of paint here, in fact. So here's another layer of off-white paint with a little crack. And you can kind of see the boundary between this layer and the later coating. So in this particular element, it was always a white or off-white color, whereas the window trim, it was deep red, almost like a brick color. And you can see this damaged, eroded, deep red paint in different areas of the window trim. So in fact, the windows must have receded visually, matching more of the surrounding brick than the cornice, which was picked out very brightly. And then what was fascinating is that we started to see remnants of yellow, hints of yellow on the brickwork and the mortars. And here's a cross-section from an area where it was protected. There's actually a struck joint here, and you can see a deep yellow very distinctly. And there is that yellow lime wash. And so this was perplexing to many people because it's always been known as a brick house. So we needed to search for more evidence to really feel confident that it had originally been a yellow lime wash. And you see little hints of deep yellow here in some protected areas of mortar. And occasionally a brick would appear that had been lime washed yellow. Or in another trapped area, you kind of have a ghost of a roof line that had protected the yellow. And there it is. This is the first deep yellow lime wash directly on top of the brick. You're seeing the kind of dark fire scale on the brick here, but there's no distinct dirt layer between the brickwork and the lime wash, which makes me think this is applied quite early on in the history of the house. Well, this has made a lot of people anxious about interpretation, to take a really giant brick house on a prominent spot in Annapolis and consider coating it with a deep yellow lime wash. So I started working with architectural historians to survey other houses in the city. This is Hammond Harwood, which is only about a block away. And there are traces of yellow lime wash in the mortar and trapped in these kind of depressions in the brick surface. Same with Ogle Hall, slightly earlier, but here again is some yellow lime wash. There are remnants at the Rideout House, nothing convincing at the John Shaw House, but we could make a case that actually this yellow lime wash was perhaps not so unusual. It's just that these types of coatings don't survive. Either taste change dramatically or they've just simply weathered away. So for the main block of the house, this is a Georgian style house from the outside, very symmetrical. But in fact, it's quite asymmetrical when you get inside, and especially on the second floor. But I'm going to talk about the main block of the house on the first floor here, the findings, and then I'll move on to a few floors on the second floor, a few rooms. And I did sample selectively in these spaces, but they're pretty blown away because of alterations, a former carriage house and the mechanicals room. And so these were only sampled very on a limited basis to see if anything remained. So here's the entry hall. This space is now a pale yellow, but in fact, it was originally a yellow distemper, which you see here, on a very coarse sandy plaster. So this wall was not only matte, but also quite grainy. You see how the sand projects out of the surface. Very different from how we see painted walls now. And then many, many generations of grain painting on the woodwork. And here's the first generation down here on top of the wood. And then everywhere you see a varnish coating, autofluorescing, kind of whitish, that's either related to the original grain painting. Here's the second generation of graining. It gets varnished over again, then maybe painted brown, another varnish. So multiple generations of coatings, which it's amazing that this survives considering what's happened to other parts of the house. And here you see Chris Mills and his crew doing work to uncover several generations of early graining. And I love that they have been posting the cross-section images adjacent for reference as they kind of work their way down through these layers. And the graining where it survives is really extraordinarily high quality and very beautiful. And in the room itself, there's a lot of areas of damaged plaster, which is why you see, exposed lath, but also later paints removed so that plaster repairs can be done to stabilize this space. But you're also seeing an emergence of the earliest yellow lime wash on the walls. Then in this sweet little office, which is the smallest room on the first floor, just adjacent to the entry, A lot of the woodwork was stripped, so you could see how sharp-edged this mantle is, for example. But fortunately, even though the window trim and the mantle were stripped, this little closet remained pretty well untouched, especially on the interior. So the paint was peeling away, so I did a little bit of mechanical removal with a scalpel, and here you see a deep blue paint emerging. So the interior of this closet was a deep Prussian blue based blue, and the exterior was grain painted, much like the adjacent stair. But here's that beautiful, coarsely ground, unevenly mixed Prussian blue paint, and it's applied not on a primer, but on top of a shellac sealant, which you see this orange fluorescent material in the wood is shellac applied to seal the wood before painting. And in this house, we see either shellac sealant or sometimes a dark red primer. And I haven't been able to figure out whether there's any kind of logic to it, but I suspect that there are a number of painters working together at any one time in this space, which is probably way we have different areas of wood prep. And of course, big chunky Prussian blue particles in that first deep blue paint layer. And all this pigment ID work goes into the final reinterpretation of the paints, which will be hand ground linseed oil based paints made as close as possible to what the original coatings were. Now we do have a couple of mysteries that I tried to solve but couldn't quite. Here is the parlor, and this is an early 20th century photograph. And if you look here on the overmantel, this block, there seems to be a landscape painting. And so the question was, can we recover this? And so by comparison, a lot of elements in this space were not stripped. So it's originally painted tan, and then olive green, and then this very grainy, coarsely ground verdigris-based green, and then a series of tans and off-whites. This was on a door architrave. However, on that central block, it was just stripped down to virtually nothing. Tiny little bit of red-brown paint, but these are all the most recent 20th century coatings. Again, maybe a little red-brown here, but not a hint of what might have been any kind of landscape painting. I did do some layer by layer overpaint removal and came down to this surface, which looks not just stripped, but also scraped. So I only did a section. We left the rest hoping maybe there's some other visual imaging technique that might be used to get a faint recovery of the original image. But so far, that hasn't been pursued. So this is the grandest space on the first floor, a very beautiful room, incredibly ornate, as you can see. And this was its palette when I started working. It has raised plaster paneling, which seems to be mostly unique to Annapolis houses of this mid-18th century, very complex and beautifully created, and then plaster cornice with multiple layers. So I sampled all these elements to try to figure out, what was the original palette of this space. And I have to say this pink ceiling was what most people were the most unhappy about. So not surprisingly, the cornice has multiple layers of unpigmented lime wash. So here's the finished plaster, and then 8 different generations of unpigmented lime wash, some with a little bit of grit between. A few have a few blue pigments, which made it a cooler, brighter white. So these really clogged up the decorations. And they were part of a test cleaning effort with Chris Mills and his crew to recover the complexity, to better understand what this original design was intended to be. Then for the woodwork and the walls, in fact, the original woodwork color was a kind of off-white, almost cream color on top of the wood. And the original plaster paneling color was also a kind of off-white. So very subdued palette in this space, except for the ceiling, which was in fact pink. And so this is a little bit of the ceiling plaster mounted upside down. and exposed to show the original pink ceiling paint. So people don't write a lot about color in the 18th century. So this is an unusual finding, but it's actually the reflection of the light from the windows onto the pink ceiling and down makes a very beautiful, warm, overall light atmosphere. Then we have this dining room, not quite as ornate, but with an equally complex cornice. And this is a little puzzling because the negative is flipped. This is 1915, but I think you can see that there was a landscape painting here also. Unfortunately, it doesn't survive as well, but it's a very tempting finding from this photograph. And again, we've got these raised plaster paneling walls. And the cornice has multiple layers of unpigmented lime wash, maybe about 10 generations until you find finely ground modern contemporary paints, opaque and thick. This room actually was more aggressively stripped than many of the other first floor rooms. We have remnants of graining on the window trim and the wainscot. This is typical, this kind of disrupted, reformed chronology of either a heat gun or a torch, where the paint layers melt and then reform, and you get a incoherent sequence of coatings. But multiple samples seem to show that this window trim was grain painted. So you see in this case, this is the room undergoing restoration. A lot of paint removal has taken place because the plaster is so damaged. And the woodwork retained virtually no early paint. So normally I wouldn't be happy about seeing paint stripping like this because you lose the physical evidence that some future researcher could use. But in fact, the previous restorations had hit this room very hard. So there was only minute amounts of evidence still left. Oh, and I do want to go back to say, in fact, we do have the original wall color, which was a yellow distemper like the entry. But the plaster walls are much smoother. These raised panels are very fine white finish plaster. So let's go up to the second floor, and you can see here's where the symmetry really breaks down. Like, I analyzed all these spaces as well as the stair hall to see, was there a relationship between the colors in each room? Did any of these colors provide clues to room use? What happened in these rooms over time? And so I'm going to start with this little room, the smallest space, although it does have a fireplace. And it was a kind of putrid green when I sampled it, but I think it was actually an effort somebody must have done some scraping tests to try to figure out maybe what was this room, because here we have the wood substrate, the pale red stain, which is the primer here, or sealant, a gray base coat, and then a very greeny, brilliant green verdigris-based paint. These are very big pigment particles. So this paint had a very much a three-dimensional quality and would have been pretty expensive for a small chamber on the second floor, but it's undeniably there. So here we had a brilliant, glossy, grainy green paint in the smallest chamber on the second floor. And then in the largest bed chamber, which is now this pale salmon color, I'm wondering if the same thing happened, because while this salmon color is kind of unusual, in fact, in the cross-section, we see that the original paint color was this grainy, unevenly mixed pale orange. So this is the first paint layer on all the woodwork in this space, and it actually, this chronology allowed me to compare elements that had been added when a partition wall was altered, where the partition wall paints started much later in the paint chronology. So these cross-sections can be great archaeological tools, and it's always helpful for me to be working with architectural historians who are asking questions about alterations. And it makes it much more meaningful in terms of interpreting and comparatively dating the paint layer sequences. Then we have this probably second best chamber. And you can see when you look at the details, it really, all the cornice elements are completely muddied by later paint layers. And I sampled the walls and cornice and mantle to try to sort out paint histories. And I have to say this one was slightly more puzzling. So it was the only room on this floor that didn't have a bright color. We've got the red stain, that sealant, with a light gray as the finished coat on the plaster, and then a similar treatment for the woodwork, red stain and then light gray. And the overpaint removal tests, to me, are puzzling. I think this is one of those things where it's pretty hard to translate what you see in the cross-section into what is revealed when overpaint removal is done. And so this is one of those ones I think would be helpful to go back, resample some of these areas where the exposures have been done and see like what layer exactly has been exposed by the paint removal and how does it relate to the cross-section evidence. So it's nice to have a back and forth on these things and to have the opportunity to go back and revisit the evidence when you have a little bit more information in hand. And in this case, while I was doing the paint analysis, I was back and forth at this house for several years, taking more samples, talking to the architectural historians, doing some scraping tests and selected overpaint removal, because the cross sections are hugely helpful, but they don't tell the whole story of the overall impact of a paint treatment. So as you probably get a sense that this is a massive, massive project. And Historic Annapolis explains on their website that they intend to restore the James Brice House to its completed 1774 appearance. The result will be an academically sound, museum-grade restoration of the exterior and interior of the house, implemented to the highest standard applied to traditional building restorations. Since the building retains most of its original fabric in the center block, much of the work beyond replacement of building systems will focus on state-of-the-art restoration of finishes, plaster, paint, masonry, wooden elements, etc., and replacement of its few missing parts. So it will be open to the tour for you for a tour, but it will be a hard hat tour. And I'm not sure what the proposed and projected completion date is, but I think walking through and seeing this house as it's undergoing restoration is going to be a fascinating exercise for those of you who can attend. So I hope this gives you some insight into what's happening with this house, and I am happy to answer questions.
Susan, thank you so much for taking the time to share your knowledge and your research with us this evening. Everyone, so this begins our Q&A portion. If you have any questions for Susan, you can feel free to pop them in the chat, and I will go ahead and ask Susan those questions for you. You're also very welcome to raise a hand and ask them yourself.
Somebody's waving.
Okay, we have a question from Pamela. Susan, any thoughts on recreating a verdigris paint?
Oh, yes, lots. I don't know how much we want to get into it, but it's amazing how many sites that I've found traditional grainy verdigris-based paints, and probably the highest visibility is Mount Vernon, and they have recreated the paints there, both in the large dining room and in the small dining room. But I think the most effective recreation where you really feel the impact of a hand-ground verdigris-based paint with a glaze is at Stratford Hall. And that's the Robert E. Lee estate. And this was done by Erica Sanchez and Chris Mills based on the paint analysis that I had done. And what we've done in working together is that they will do the mock-ups. And there's almost always a pale gray base coat or a pale blue base coat because these verdigris paints are not completely opaque. So you have to have the right base coat color as well as the finish color. And you can go online to Stratford Hall and see these spaces, the dining room and adjacent space and hall, where these greens have been replicated, and they're really stunning. They are so different from anything you see with commercial paints because of their varying gloss, their three-dimensional quality, their texture. They're just gorgeous. And so I think that's probably going to happen with the recreated verdigris paints here at Brice House. In fact, I think they're planning to have hand-ground paints for all of the interpreted rooms applied with traditional round brushes. So they're as close as you could get to 18th century recreations as possible, I think.
Susan, this is
Hi.
Catherine
Hi,
Matson.
Catherine.
How are you?
Good.
Thank you for the presentation. The pink on the ceiling, the second floor room,
Oh, yeah, that's the first floor drawing room.
first floor drawing room. The pink on plaster is what is on on the second floor drawing room of the Corbett Sharp house. It was very thick,
Oh,
but I've never heard of the ceilings being painted, and it's just, I guess, something that I've never thought. I never hear of other paint analysts sampling the ceiling. And I mean, how widespread do you think using, having an applied color is?
yeah, I would say I don't know because in so many cases the plaster ceilings haven't survived. You
Yeah.
know, the plaster has dropped off the lath, and then when you get to the house, it's all been replastered, so there's no early 18th century evidence left. But here, the plaster ceiling is completely intact. So I suspect there are painted ceilings that we just aren't finding because they haven't survived. But the
Yeah.
pink is so fascinating.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. We have a question in the chat. Did you determine what pigments were used to affect the pale pink ceiling and the orange tone in that second floor bedroom?
Yeah, so the orange tone in the second floor bedroom, that's white lead with a high proportion of red lead and calcium carbonate. And the pink ceiling in the drawing room is mostly red ochre in a lime wash. So yeah, they're different, very different, intentionally different, I think.
Hi, Susan. This is Caroline.
Hi.
Hi. I had a question. You showed a cross section where you had identified some grain painting, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you're able to like recognize fine details like that in the cross section.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have looked at thousands of samples. So when I have the chance to do it, if I see grain painting, which is typically, if you look at the recipe books, they say that the base coat color for the graining should be the lightest color of the figure of the wood to be imitated. and then the glaze will be a darker color, and then a varnish coating. So there's usually a very predictable sequence, which is in its most complex form, a primer, a base coat color, a glaze, and a varnish. So when you see that all together in one generation of coating, that's usually a clue to graining or to marbleizing. And then if I have a chance to do it, then I'll do some selected overpaint removal and see if I can recover a pattern. And, on a grander scale, that's what Chris Mills was doing. But I would say it is a kind of predictable sequence of coating, and you almost always expect to see a varnish on the top because they're trying to create the appearance of a cabinet grade fine finished wood.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, Susan. To follow up on Caroline's question, I think. Um, sorry. If assuming that isn't a lot of the wood grain finish left, you mentioned that that the initial layer, the preparatory layer, the color of it is used to the color is often specific to the species of wood that they're attempting to imitate. Can you extrapolate from that lower level to sort of give the folks doing the reproduction graining an idea of what species of wood? Are there like repeatable patterns in like what colors they use for specific species of wood? Sorry, I didn't get to.
Yeah. So there are a few recipe books from the early 19th century, which give very specific colors that could be used to imitate like rosewood or mahogany or oak. But typically when I see like a yellow base coat color and a light brown glaze, that would be a clue to oak, whereas a dark red base coat color and even a darker glaze and varnish, that might be something like rosewood. And then mahogany, there's a variety of base coat colors, but I've seen like deep yellow, pink, reddish. So if you just think about the natural mahogany color, like the painters are really, for the most part, unless it's kind of a fanciful finish, they're looking at the woods and trying to recapture that effect. So yeah, I can give people some clues. I can't tell them anything about the pattern, but you can usually discriminate, for example, oak from mahogany.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure. I hope for those of you who see the house on Saturday, look carefully at these areas. I think they'll take you through the whole house so you can kind of relate the paint evidence to what's visible now as it undergoes restoration.
Susan, is there anything that you would recommend we ask, or any questions that you recommend we bring up during the tour? Anything that we wouldn't necessarily think about initially, but has a really good story behind it that that our docent leading us through would have have fun telling us about?
You might ask them how the record books for James Brice has helped guide the interpretation of the original appearance, because they know a lot about the materials that were bought for the house. I think they know some of the cabinet makers, and it's a very, very specific account book, and it's a very rich trove of evidence for a restoration.
Wonderful, thank you.
And I hope they'll take you to see the state-of-the-art climate control system that they're installing in the back area below ground of the house.
I just want to check. It did seem like somebody just tried to say hello. Um, if that person would please raise their hand, if you know how to do that in the React option. Just want to make note of that.
I might know a lot of people from all my years teaching microscopy at Winterthur. So 20 years of teaching the type of work I do, which has always been very satisfying.
Hi, Susan. I wanted to say hello. Pam
Oh,
Kirsch.
hi, Pam. How are you?
You. Great to see your work. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Well, Jen, if you have any other comments, I can turn it over to you, but it looks like we are we'll keep the chat open if anyone else has any burning last minute questions. But I'd like to take this moment where there was a little bit of a pause to say thank you very much to our guest speaker tonight, Susan Buck. Also, I wanted to just thank everyone on the WCG board for organizing and putting together this meeting. And as well as we're so glad that you were able to come join us tonight for everyone that's attending in the audience.
Thank you for asking me to speak. It's been a pleasure.
All right, well, wonderful. Thank you all so much. And we'll go ahead and bring the meeting to a close. But if you have any other questions for Susan, you of course are welcome to reach out to the WCG at email, and we can always forward them on.
Okay, thank you.